This is Lauren Kimball for ANI 150, and today's tutorial is just a quick introduction into the Maya interface. Now, if you don't have Maya at home, you can download it by going to the Autodesk website and creating an account using your student login. And using your student login with that .edu suffix, you're able to access a free educational license for 2 years. All right, but once you have Maya loaded onto your machine, and you open it up, and usually this little pop-up shows up that tells you what's new in Maya. You can just close that out and you'll see this viewpoint here. Now, this big gray window in the middle, this is your main viewport. It's called your perspective view. You can see the title of it down here toward the bottom in the center. And this is where everything you create is going to be managed and looked at. So to look around and kind of toggle this viewport, go ahead and hold down the Alt key on your keyboard, and then using your mouse, you can either click with the left mouse button and rotate your view, the middle mouse button, move it side to side, up, down, or the right mouse button, which allows you to zoom. So go ahead and kind of play with those buttons and get kind of a sense on how you're going to navigate. Now, if you get kind of silly with it and you lose yourself, you can go ahead and press F. The hotkey F will bring everything back into focus. Okay? Now, typically it's going to center you back to the grid, but if you have created something in Maya and you click on that thing, you can press F and center on that object. Okay? So, next we're going to talk about your spacebar. So go ahead and click the spacebar real quick. Now, if you hold it down, this pops up, and this is called your hotbox, and we're going to talk about the hotbox here in just a second. However, if you just tap that spacebar, then 4 different viewports open. So you got your top view, front view, side view, and there's a whole other set of panels that you can access right here. If I were, for example, to click here on my perspective view, going up here, clicking panels allows you to select all sorts of different panels. You can create panels. There are orthographic views, front view, side view, top view. You can create additional views. We're not going to really mess with that right now. I just want you to know that it's there. When you click spacebar, and let's say I wanted to look in the top view, if I let my mouse hover over the top view and press spacebar, then it makes the top view take over the whole viewport. Click spacebar again, put my mouse over the perspective view, and that'll be my main window. Now I'm going to go over here and just create an asset. This is a little pyramid, like a little cone, sorry. I created this cone so that when I press spacebar, you can kind of see the different viewport changes. So clearly this is the top view, front view, side view. All right, so I'm going to delete that because I'm not really ready to create anything yet. We're still going over the interface. Next, we want to talk about the different menus. Over here in the upper left-hand corner, you see that there's this little drop-down menu that says Modeling. Now, by default, you're in the Modeling viewport, but if I click on Rigging, well, not viewport, but I mean menu set. When I click on Rigging, notice right here, like File, Edit, Create, all this stuff stays the same, but everything to the right of it, Skeleton, Skin, Deform, Constrain, these are all things that have to do with rigging. If I change this to Modeling, see how the buttons change? And Animation, different menus, Effects, different menus, you get the idea. We're going to stick with Modeling because this is a modeling class that this tutorial is for, and these are going to be the main tools that are tool menus that we're going to be utilizing. Okay? Now, underneath that, you have what are called shelf tabs. You've got curves, surfaces, poly modeling, rigging, animation. And we're going to keep this set to poly modeling right now, but just know that there's all sorts of tabs with different tools. If you have certain plugins, they might have custom tools set to that, and you can actually create your own shelves, which we're going to cover later in the semester. All right? So next we're going to talk about the toolbar over here to the left. Now, this tool here, this little arrow, that is your select tool, and that's by default is what's turned on when you first open Maya. And the hotkey for that, and this is really important, is the letter Q, because you're going to want this, you want to be able to grab this select tool quickly. And so Your main 4 hotkeys when you're manipulating something inside of Maya are Q, W, E, and R. Now pay attention to the toolbar here to the left, and you'll see that as I select each of those keys, a different button is being selected. So W corresponds to the Move tool, E the Rotate, and R the Scale. And if you look at your keyboard, you know, the standard like QWERTY keyboard or QWERTY keyboard, you'll notice that Q, W, E, R, those hotkeys are all right next to each other with your left hand. So ideally you'll be able to move around in the viewport and very quickly decide if you want to move, rotate, or scale an object. Those hotkeys are chosen for convenience of their location on a standard QWERTY keyboard. Now I'm going to create something real quick. I'm going to go over here to the poly modeling shelf, and you see these basic shapes. These are called Polygon Primitives. And I'm just going to click one. I'm just going to click a square, or cube, I'm sorry, and I'm going to press F. Notice how before, if I like click off of the cube and press F, well, when nothing was in my scene, then it would center on the grid. But now that I've got this object, I can press F and zoom in on that selection quickly. Now, if I click on, I'm going to zoom out a little bit because I don't need to be that close to it. If I press W, notice that this translation tool appears. It's going to allow me to translate or move my object either along the x-axis, the z-axis, or along the y-axis up and down. Now these little boxes that are floating in the air next to it, this allows us to move in 2 directions at once if we want to. So this is allowing me to move on the y and the x-axis alone, over here on the z and the y-axis alone. I'm gonna undo. To undo is Control Z, by the way. If you're working on a Mac like I am, then it's going to be Command Z. Now if I grab the very middle, I can kind of move in all directions. The problem with moving in all directions is even though I appear to be moving like left to right, I don't exactly know what's going on. Like, well, this isn't specifically the z-axis, but here, let me move this way. So right now I'm moving along the x and the y axes, but in using that middle box, there's always the chance this thing's moving backward in the z-axis in a way I'm not anticipating. So just be aware, if you grab that middle, sometimes it's moving exactly like you think it is. Sometimes it's not. If you want to be very specific with how you move an object, just grab the arrows. That's the best way to go about moving things in Maya. Okay? Now, if I click on my rotate, which is my E hotkey, same thing. I've got, you know, those different colors representing the different directions that I can move my object in. And of course, you got this large circle on the outside that kind of allows you to toggle in any which direction, which can also be accessed by clicking in the middle. And then of course, R is your scale tool. You can scale in all directions, or you can scale in one direction at a time, or you can scale 2 different directions at the same time. Okay? And you can kind of play around with that and get used to utilizing that tool. And of course, if I don't want to scale, rotate, or move, I just want to select an object, that's my Q hotkey, which is my select key. Now below that select tool, and between, above the translation, rotate, and move tool, you've got these two. This one is basically a lasso tool, and the one underneath it is called the paint selection tool. And we're going to talk about those a little bit later on, but we're going to move over them right now. Below these basic tools, you've got these 4 buttons here. And if I click this, nothing happens because this represents your perspective view. If I click this, it opens the 4 different panels. So basically what your spacebar does is what these 2 buttons represent. Now if I click this one here, it gives me a dual panel layout. So maybe I don't want 4 different panels, maybe I only want 2. That just gives me a different way, different option of looking at things. The 3rd button is called your outliner, and this is critical. The outliner is going to be one of your best friends. The outliner is an itinerary of everything in your scene. So anytime I have an object like this cube, it creates a cube with a default name. I can double click that inside the outliner and name the asset. Like I could be like cube 01 or whatever this asset is to me. If I were modeling a TV, I could name it TV. So you're able to name things in the outliner, and you're able to click on things and delete them when you don't need them anymore. Now, by default, there are 6 assets listed in the outliner. These are your default assets. If I clicked on any one of these and tried to delete them, a little error would come down here on the command line saying, oh, that's a non-deletable node. So these 4 things, they're always going to be there. They're there just so that Maya can function. Just leave that alone. But anything you create, like a sphere, a cube, all of that's going to be listed here. Now, to turn off your outliner, you just click on the outliners button again. All right, so let's see. Next down here on the bottom, we've got, sorry, I clear my throat. Down here along the bottom, this is your timeline and your command line for putting in code. And over here on the far right, you have something called the script editor. We're not going to go into any of these right now. A lot of this is going to be dealt with during the main 3D animation class, where we actually talk about setting keys and animating rigs. But for this entry-level modeling class, we are not going to be messing with those tools. Okay? To your right, you have what is called your channel box and attribute editor. You can select them by clicking on these little tabs to the far right. Now there's one in the middle called the modeling toolkit, and we are not going to touch on that for right now. We're going to come back to it a little bit later on, but right now we're just going to talk about what the channel box and the attribute editor do. Channel box is going to be telling you coordinates and information about your mesh. So if I created a cube and my channel box, you've got like translate, rotate, scale, everything that I do to this little box, or this, I keep calling it a box, this little cube is going to be represented numerically in these little boxes here, and all these little channels. So you've got the Y channel, and you've got the Z channel, and you can type in custom coordinates to any of these. So if I wanted this to move 5 units over on the Z, I type in 5 and press enter, and that asset will move. Alternatively, I could type in 0 and ask these, or ask the cube to go back to its 0 point, which is essentially the coordinates for when it was created, unless I freeze transformations. Now, the attribute editor is typically, the one that's behind the channel box. I could click these tabs, but ideally I'm pressing Control A. Control A allows me to toggle between channel box and attribute editor, and because the channel box and the attribute editor are going to become so critical throughout this course, it's good to know what that shortcut is so that you can quickly jump between the two. Now the attribute editor is going to have basically different attributes of your mesh. As you build more complex things in Maya, everything that you do to an asset is going to create nodes with assets inside the attribute editor. So right now, the most basic things applied to this mesh are the fact that it's a cube, its shape node, its shading group information, and its material shader. So right now it says Lambert. The Lambert is a default material inside Maya, so that anything I create in Maya, no matter what sort of object or thing I create, is always going to have this dull gray shade to it. That's the default Lambert. And we're going to talk about in later classes how to make other Lamberts, or not just Lamberts, but blends and fongs and all sorts of different shader types. We're going to talk about how to apply those to meshes, how to change the color and apply custom textures, how to UV map. These are all things that we're going to cover later on. The important thing to know right now, the takeaway, is that by using Control A, I can get into this thing called the channel box that allows me to put in custom coordinates for something I create, and the attribute editor, which tells me a little bit about that thing and all the different, how do I describe this? All the sort of different tools that I've utilized on this things that I've assigned to this mesh. So I hope that wasn't too convoluted. Let me go ahead and create another cube. Yeah, you'll notice right off that if I go over here to the Lambert, that it has a color option that you can change the shadows or the shading, or if I click on the color, I can actually change the color. I'd encourage you not to do this just yet because, again, whatever color I change this to will be applied to everything I create from then on out. But I will be covering how to apply different shaders in later tutorials or in the classroom. Okay? Now I'm going to press Control A and go back to the channel box. There's a couple other things I want to point out. When you first create an asset, you've got something called the input. Right now the only input on this mesh is the basic cube attributes, such as the width, height, depth of this newly created mesh. So you can actually go into this and change things such as subdivisions, which allow me to add essentially more edge loops within a mesh. And again, this isn't really critical for this first introduction, but later on as we progress in the class, we're going to be revisiting this. This is just me touching on it, letting you know that this is there. Underneath that, you have layers. We got display layers and animation layers. Now, animation layers we're not going to be touching on to the 245 class, but for 150, we're going to be using display layers quite a bit. So what is a display layer? If you've ever worked inside of Photoshop, you know that you can create different layers that have different, color information or line information. If you're drawing something, you can add more details onto different layers that you can turn off later. Display layers are going to work a lot like that. So there are 4 main buttons to pay attention to with display layers. These first 2 buttons with the arrows, if you have layers listed, you can click on one and organize them using these arrows. The other 2 are a create an empty layer button, and then the one with the little circle is to create a layer based on something selected in the scene. So this first layer that I've created, I'm just going to delete it by right-clicking and delete. I'm going to click this box that I've created, this cube, and I'm going to go over here and I'm going to click on the little circle that's sitting above what looks like a piece of paper that's actually the plane, and I'm going to click it. And this time with this layer, this cube that I had selected is going to be in that layer, and I'll know it's in that layer 2 ways. First, note my inputs, how I just had the polygon cube information. I now have layer information. This is just telling me that this asset is on a layer. And if I go over here, you see this little V? That means visibility. If I turn it off, it's no longer visible. It's like I have nothing in my scene. So I can hide it using that V box. And I can double click and name this layer like cube. So I remember that the cube's on there. Boop, boop. Okay? So the next thing that I want to talk about is the hotbox. So we kind of glanced over this at the beginning. If you hold down your spacebar, you've got this menu that appears. And everything that is up here, so the modeling, rigging, animation, effects, you know how you get these different options when you go into those different drop-down menu options? If you click on the hotbox, this is everything that is inside of, that is stored up in these different options. Is just by holding down the hotbox. So it's just a different way, more efficient way to navigate Maya. So if you've been working in Maya for a while, you can actually hide everything except your perspective viewport and just work from the hotbox. Okay, so as you can see, file, edit, create, the same things that are up here, right here. This, underneath the word Maya, this very first set of options are your modeling tools. Underneath that, you've got your rigging tools, etc., etc. If I go into Hotbox Controls right here, and mind you, I'm holding down the space bar to make this visible if you didn't catch that. Pressing the space bar once allows you to see all 4 viewports, and just holding down that space bar allows you to see the hotbox. So I can go over to Hotbox Controls, and I could say I only want to see modeling tools, modeling only. And then it's going to hide everything except the modeling tools. Or I can click Show All and see all my tools. So it's just another way of navigating Maya. But you're going to bump into it quite a bit because the space bar is such a big part of navigating within the Maya interface. All right, so next we're going to talk about the polygon itself. So we've created what's called a polygon primitive. Up here in the Poly Modeling tab, we've got some basic polygon primitives that we can start out with, things like the sphere, the cube, the cylinder, the cone. We got this donut-shaped one called torus, right? Yep. And a polygon plane, just a flat plane. You've also got these ones in green. In my 2018, these were brand new. So you've got this green bracket around it. Anything that has the green bracket, like if I click UV menu, and the reason I picked the UV menu is they had a lot of updates in 2018 for the UV editor, you'll see that a lot of different options have green on them. And that's just telling you that something was updated in that tool or it's a brand new tool. So these three meshes here are like a sort of smart mesh. When I push create polygon primitives, they're called super shapes. I've not really played with them all that much, but for right now, for this tutorial, I only want to talk about the basic primitives instead of going into these super shapes, okay? So let's get rid of all these and just create a standard cube again, okay? So for your first assignment, the participation assignment, we're just going to be building things by stacking primitives. But there's another thing you can do with primitives, and that is, when you are, let me try again, sorry. When you are just sort of manipulating things like as a whole, and you decide to rotate them as a whole, or scale and play with them as a whole, you are interacting with that asset in what's called object mode, okay? There's another mode called component mode. So notice how the cube turned blue. It turned blue and purple-ish because I am now in component mode, meaning that I can now manipulate different components within that cube. If I press F8, that's the hotkey that toggles between object and component mode, it'll take me back to object mode. So best way to remember is that if your object's green, it's in object mode. If it's blue, and in this case with little purple vertices, you're dealing with component mode. All right? So let's talk about the different component modes real quick. First, I'm going to take this cube and put it back to 0 so that it's, oops, scale 1, translate 0. So it's in the center of my screen. And I'm going to right-click. When I right-click over an object I've selected, you can see things like edge, vertex, and face. So these are the three main component modes that we're going to be focused on. Edge allows you to grab any edge that is present on the object. And just like before, we can use the W, E, or R keys to scale that edge, move the edge, or rotate the edge. Alternatively, you have vertex, and the different vertices can also be moved. You can't really scale a single vertice, but if you grab two vertices, you can kind of scale as a way of moving multiple vertices at a time. You can rotate multiple vertices. The other option is face, which, just like it sounds, are these different faces. And I can go ahead and move those faces. Okay? All right, so for your first little introductory assignment, I'll put that in object mode and delete it. We're going to just be manipulating those polygon primitives to make a simple structure. And that's what we're going to pick up on in the other tutorial, which I don't believe, if you're just stumbling upon this tutorial on YouTube, the other tutorial that goes with this is only going to be visible to students. If you have questions, feel free to send me an email, and yeah, just keep an eye out for that other tutorial.